Moving on is not a decision that arrives cleanly. It does not come with the obvious clarity of a door slamming, or a line clearly crossed, or a single moment so definitive that the path forward becomes unmistakable. For most people who have loved an avoidant, the decision to move on is made not once but dozens of times, made and unmade and made again across weeks and months of a pattern that keeps almost changing but never quite does. The hope keeps surviving. The evidence keeps accumulating. And somewhere in the tension between the hope and the evidence, the decision waits, not for a dramatic catalyst, but for the quiet, exhausted, deeply personal moment of reckoning in which the honest truth finally outweighs the comfortable possibility. This is an attempt to make that reckoning a little cleaner. Not easier. The decision to move on from someone you genuinely love does not become easy through clarity, but cleaner, more honest, more grounded in what is actually present rather than what is theoretically possible. These are the signs. Not rules, not a checklist to be applied mechanically, but the honest, observable, behavioral markers that distinguish a situation where continued investment is reasonable from one where it is costing you more than any connection has the right to cost. When the growth is always theoretical. There is a particular conversation that happens in relationships with avoidance with a frequency that, once noticed, becomes almost predictable. The conversation about change, about what they recognize in themselves, what they want to work on, what they understand now that they did not understand before. It is, in these moments, entirely possible to believe that the understanding is the beginning of the change, that the recognition of the pattern is the first step toward its interruption. That this time, the insight will translate into something different. Sometimes it does. Genuine insight, held honestly and pursued with real commitment to the discomfort that change requires, does occasionally produce the different thing. People do change. Avoidant attachment is not a life sentence, and the person who engages seriously with why they are the way they are and what it is costing them and the people they love, who pursues that engagement through the sustained, unglamorous work of genuine therapeutic process rather than through the periodic declaration of intention, can, and sometimes does, develop a meaningfully different capacity for closeness. But insight without action is not change. It is the most sophisticated form of staying the same while appearing to move. And the sign that moving on has become necessary is when the conversation about growth has been happening in essentially the same form, for long enough that the gap between the understanding and the behavior has stopped narrowing. When every difficult moment produces the same acknowledgement and the same temporary adjustment and the same return to the baseline pattern, when you can predict, with an accuracy that breaks something in you each time the prediction is confirmed, exactly what the cycle will do next. The theoretical growth is not nothing. The avoidant who can name their pattern is closer to changing it than the one who cannot. But you are not in a relationship with their theoretical future self. You are in a relationship with their actual present behavior. And if the actual present behavior has not changed, not marginally adjusted, but genuinely, sustainably changed, across a time frame that any honest assessment would call significant, the theory is not a reason to stay. It is the most articulate form of the same reason you have always had to go, when your needs have become invisible to you. There is a specific adaptation that people who love avoidance develop over time. It is so gradual, so incremental in its installation that most people do not notice it happening until they are already thoroughly inside it. The adaptation is the progressive minimization of their own needs, not through a single decision to suppress, but through the accumulated experience of having needs that were consistently met with withdrawal, deflection, or the subtle communication that the needing itself was the problem. You learn, not consciously. The nervous system learns before the mind does. You learn which needs are safe to express and which will generate the retreat. You learn the emotional volume that is tolerable and the volume that triggers the distance. You learn to soften the expression of what you want until the expression no longer accurately represents the want. You learn to celebrate the small availabilities as though they were complete fulfillment, not because you are deluded, but because the alternative, holding the small availability against the full need and measuring the gap, is too consistently painful to do indefinitely. And at some point, the adaptation becomes so thorough that you have lost reliable access to what you actually need. You are no longer certain what a fully met need would feel like. You have been living inside the gap for so long that the gap has started to feel like the normal dimensions of what relationship is. This is the sign that is most difficult to recognize from the inside and most important to act on when it is recognized. Not because the avoidant has failed you in some dramatic or deliberate way, they may not even be aware of the adaptation they have generated in you, but because a relationship that has required you to make yourself this small is not a relationship that is serving you. It is a relationship that is consuming you. And the self that has been progressively minimized in order to make the connection survivable is a self that deserves, with urgency, to be reclaimed. Moving on, in this context, is not an act of giving up on the relationship. It is an act of returning to yourself, of deciding that the full version of who you are, with all your needs intact and unminimized and expressed without the prior calculation of whether expressing them will cost you the warmth you have been so carefully managing, deserves to be the version that a relationship is built around, when the connection only exists in the good moments. Every relationship has good moments. The avoidant, when they are available, when the fear has temporarily subsided and the closeness is feeling manageable and the warmth that genuinely exists between them and the person they care about is finding its expression, can be extraordinary. The connection in those moments is real. The depth of it, the specific quality of being with someone who is, in those windows, fully present and genuinely engaging, this is real, and it is not nothing, and it is, in large part, why the staying happens as long as it does. But a relationship is not the sum of its best moments. It is the whole of its ordinary ones. It is the Tuesday evenings and the difficult conversations and the moments when you need something, and the question is whether the person across from you is available for the needing. It is what exists in the absence of the optimal conditions that the good moments require. The sign that moving on is necessary is when an honest accounting reveals that the connection primarily, or only, exists in the good moments. That outside of those windows, in the ordinary, in the difficult, in the sustained and unglamorous middle of what a shared life actually consists of, there is not enough present to constitute what you went into the connection hoping to build, that you have been, in the spaces between the good moments, essentially alone, carrying the full weight of the connection's maintenance. Doing the emotional labor of two people while one person's contribution arrives only when the conditions are right and disappears when they are not. The good moments are real. They are not sufficient. And the question to hold honestly is not whether the good moments are worth something. They are. But whether they are worth the entirety of what living around their absence has been costing you. When hope has become its own harm. Hope is not always the ally it presents as. In the right conditions, in a situation where the evidence genuinely supports the possibility of a different outcome, where the movement is real and the direction is clear and the investment on both sides is present in sufficient measure, hope is the appropriate, life-serving response. It orients toward possibility. It sustains effort. It keeps the door open when keeping it open is wise. But hope in the wrong conditions is harm. Hope that is not grounded in current evidence, but in past warmth and future possibility, and the persistent, emotionally necessary belief that the person you love contains the version of themselves that the relationship has always needed. This hope does not serve you. It serves the continuation of a situation that the evidence, examined honestly, does not support continuing. The sign is this. When you notice that your hope is primarily generated not by what is currently happening, but by what once happened or might eventually happen, something important is being communicated. The present moment, held in honest view, is not generating reasons to stay. The reasons to stay live in memory and in imagination, in the best version of what was and the theoretical version of what could be, rather than in the actual, current, observable reality of the relationship as it exists right now. Hope grounded in the present is a reason. Hope that requires the avoidance of the present in order to survive is not. It is the mind's way of protecting itself from a conclusion it is not yet ready to reach, and treating it with the gentleness of something that has been working very hard to keep you from a pain that is, eventually, the only path toward something better. When you have become the sole investor, relationships require reciprocal investment to sustain themselves as genuine connections rather than devolving into caretaking arrangements in which one person's needs are continuously secondary to the management of another's limitations. Reciprocity does not mean identical. People bring different capacities, different emotional vocabularies, different abilities to give at different times. Genuine reciprocity has texture and variation and does not require the accounting of equal transactions. But there is a threshold below which the variation ceases to be variation and becomes a structural imbalance. And the sign that this threshold has been crossed is the specific, consistent exhaustion of someone who has been carrying the connection, its maintenance, its momentum, its emotional weight, essentially alone. Who initiates, who reaches, who holds the hope and does the labor of return after the avoidance withdrawals, and makes the space for the vulnerability that the avoidant occasionally offers and supports the growth that the avoidant occasionally attempts. When the honest answer to the question of what the connection would look like if you stopped investing is that it would not exist, that the connection is sustained entirely by your effort and would immediately or quickly collapse without it, that answer is the sign. Not because effort is wrong, not because loving someone who struggles requires nothing of you, but because a connection that exists only as long as you sustain it single-handedly is not a connection. It is a responsibility. And you did not sign up to be responsible for another person's capacity to show up in relationship. You signed up to be in one, moving on from someone you love, from someone whose depth you understand, whose fear you can see beneath the surface of, whose potential you have genuinely believed in, is one of the hardest things a person can do. It does not feel like strength in the moment. It feels like loss, like failure, like the abandonment of something that deserved more effort or more time or a different version of you that might have found the way through. It is not failure, it is the conclusion of an honest reckoning. The acknowledgement that love, however real, is not sufficient without the capacity to sustain it. That potential, however genuinely present, is not the same as the actuality of a person who is here consistently in the full and present and choosing way that you have always deserved. You are not moving on from who they could be. You are moving toward who you already are. And that person, the one who loved generously and waited patiently and finally, with every reason to, chose themselves, deserves what comes next. Entirely, without apology, without looking back for long,